You ever read a quote that made you so mad, so uncomfortable, that you wanted to close the book, toss it, and never think about it again? Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me when I stumbled across these 3 quotes from Carl Jung. I didn't know it at the time, but those words would completely change my life. At first, they pissed me off, like really pissed me off. They poked at parts of me I wasn't ready to face, but eventually they set me free. And today, I'm going to take you on that exact same journey. By the end of this video, you're not just going to understand these quotes, you're going to feel them. And trust me, they're going to challenge you in ways you don't expect. The first quote that got under my skin was this: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Now, let me be real with you. When I first read that, I rolled my eyes. I thought, what does that even mean? My unconscious, fate. What is Jung even talking about? But you know what? That's exactly the kind of reaction this quote is supposed to trigger. Because here's the thing, Jung is pointing at something we don't want to believe, that there's a huge part of us running on autopilot, a part of us we're not even aware of, and the kicker, that part of us is in charge. It's making decisions for us, shaping our relationships, guiding our careers, and we don't even realize it. Think about it. Have you ever found yourself in the same kind of toxic relationship over and over again? Or maybe you keep self-sabotaging every time you get close to success. You start to think, why does this always happen to me? Is it bad luck? Am I cursed? But what Jung is saying is that it's not fate. It's not bad luck. It's you. Or rather, it's the parts of you that you're not aware of. The unconscious parts, calling the shots. Click subscribe to this channel to get more insights into human psychology. This hit me hard because I started to reflect on my own patterns. I realized that I was stuck in a loop. I'd overwork myself, burn out, and then blame the world for not appreciating me. But here's what made me mad. Jung was saying that I was doing this to myself. My unconscious beliefs about needing to prove my worth, about not being enough, were driving my behavior, and I was blind to it. Psychologists have done experiments that prove just how much of our behavior is unconscious. One famous study involved participants being primed with words related to old age. Words like wrinkled, retired, grey. After the experiment, the participants who had been exposed to these words actually walked more slowly down the hallway compared to participants who weren't. They didn't realize it, but those words had activated unconscious associations in their minds, and it changed their behavior. That's how powerful the unconscious is. So what do we do about it? How do we make the unconscious conscious? Jung's answer was shadow work. He believed that the unconscious wasn't just this mysterious black box. It was something we could interact with. The shadow, as Jung called it, is made up of all the parts of ourselves that we've rejected, suppressed, or denied. These are the traits we don't like to admit we have. Jealousy, rage, insecurity, selfishness. We push them into the shadow because they're uncomfortable to face, but they don't go away. Instead, they control us from the background. Here's a practical exercise you can try. Think about someone who really annoys you. Maybe it's a coworker who's always bragging or a friend who's constantly flaking on plans. Now ask yourself, what is it about them that bothers me so much? And this is the hard part. Ask yourself if that trait exists in you. Because often, the things we hate in others are the things we're denying in ourselves. That's shadow work. It's about turning the mirror on yourself and being brutally honest about what you see. When I did this, it was like a punch to the gut. I realized that the people I judged for being selfish were actually reflecting my own fear of being selfish. I had spent so much time trying to be the nice guy, the one who always says yes, that I had buried any sense of self-prioritization deep in my shadow. And because I wasn't aware of it, it would come out in unhealthy ways. Resentment, passive aggressiveness, burnout. At first, I hated this process. It made me feel exposed, vulnerable, and honestly kind of gross. But then something incredible happened. The more I faced my shadow, the more I started to feel free. I wasn't just reacting to life anymore. I was starting to understand myself on a deeper level, and that gave me a sense of control I'd never felt before. This brings me to the second quote. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. When I read this, I felt called out, like painfully called out. I started thinking about all the ways I distract myself, scrolling endlessly on social media, binge watching TV shows, working late hours even when I don't need to. And it's not just me.we all do this. We fill our lives with noise, with busyness, with anything that keeps us from sitting still and actually facing ourselves. Why? Because facing yourself is hard, it's uncomfortable. It forces you to confront things you'd rather ignore. There's a psychological experiment that illustrates this perfectly. Researchers asked participants to sit alone in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts. They also gave them the option to administer a small electric shock to themselves if they wanted to. You'd think people would just sit there, right? Wrong. A significant number of participants chose to shock themselves rather than sit in silence. That's how much we avoid facing our inner worlds. When I really thought about this quote, I realized that all the distractions in my life were just a way to avoid facing my own fears and insecurities. I was terrified of failure, of not being good enough, of being alone. And instead of dealing with those feelings, I was numbing them with busyness and distractions. But here's the paradox. The more we avoid facing ourselves, the more those fears control us. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You can keep it down for a while, but eventually it's going to pop back up, and when it does, it's going to hit you in the face. So how do we stop avoiding ourselves? One of the most powerful tools I've found is mindfulness. This isn't just about meditating for 10 minutes a day, although that's a great place to start. It's about being fully present with whatever you're feeling, without judgment. If you're scared, be scared. If you're angry, be angry. Don't try to push it away or distract yourself from it. Just sit with it. The first time I tried this, it was honestly awful. I felt this wave of anxiety that I had been ignoring for weeks, and my first instinct was to grab my phone or turn on the TV. But instead, I stayed with it. I let myself feel it. And you know what? It passed. It didn't destroy me. It didn't last forever. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't have to be afraid of my own emotions. They were just signals, messages from my unconscious, trying to tell me something. The second quote really stayed with me. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. It's like a mirror that reflects something most of us don't want to see. What really hit me, though, was how much this wasn't just about the big distractions in life, like work or social media. It's also about the small, subtle ways we avoid ourselves every single day. Have you ever noticed how quickly you reach for your phone the moment you feel bored or lonely? That's not just a habit, it's avoidance. It's a way of saying, I don't want to deal with what I'm feeling right now. Jung's quote calls us out on this, and it's uncomfortable because it forces us to admit how often we run from ourselves. But there's a deeper layer here, one that I didn't fully grasp at first. Avoidance isn't just about fear. It's also about shame. We avoid facing our souls because deep down, we're afraid we won't like what we find. Maybe we'll discover that we're not as kind or strong or capable as we thought we were. Maybe we'll uncover wounds that we've been carrying for years, wounds that we've convinced ourselves don't exist anymore. And that's scary. It's easier to fill our lives with distractions than it is to face that kind of vulnerability. But here's the thing. Avoiding yourself doesn't make those wounds go away. It just keeps them festering in the background, where they quietly influence everything you do. Jung understood this better than anyone. He believed that the process of individuation, becoming your true, authentic self, required confronting the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding. And that's not a one-time thing. It's a lifelong journey. Let me share something personal. There was a point in my life when I was terrified of being alone. I didn't even realize it at the time, but I would do anything to avoid being by myself. Constantly surrounding myself with people, filling my schedule to the brim, always keeping busy. But when I started reflecting on this quote, I had to ask myself, what am I so afraid of? Why can't I just sit with myself? The answer wasn't pretty. I was afraid that if I stopped moving, if I stopped distracting myself, I would have to face all the feelings I'd been suppressing. Loneliness, insecurity, self-doubt. And that realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized that I wasn't just avoiding my soul, I was avoiding my pain, and in doing so, I was also avoiding my growth. This is where the hard work begins. It's not enough to just acknowledge that you're avoiding yourself, you have to actually do the work to face what's inside. One exercise that helped me was journaling. But not the kind of journaling where you just write about your day or make a to-do list. I'm talking about raw, unfiltered journaling. Sit down with a pen and paper and write whatever comes to mind. Don't censor yourself. Don't worry about whether it makes sense. Just let it flow. At first, it might feel awkward or even pointless, but if you stick with it, you might be surprised by what comes up. When I started doing this, I uncovered feelings and memories that I hadn't thought about in years. Some of it was painful, but it was also liberating. I started to see patterns in my thoughts and behaviors, patterns that I hadn't been conscious of before. And once I saw them, I could start to change them. That's what Jung means when he says we have to face our souls. It's not about judging or criticizing yourself. It's about understanding yourself on a deeper level. This brings us to the third quote, which, for me, was the most challenging of all. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When I first read this, I thought, what does that even mean? Aren't I already myself? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't. I was living a version of myself that was shaped by other people's expectations. What my family wanted me to be, what society said I should be, what I thought I needed to be in order to fit in or succeed. And here's the hard truth. Most of us are doing the same thing. We're not living as our true selves, we're living as the versions of ourselves that we think will be accepted. This quote pissed me off because it made me question everything. If I wasn't being true to myself, then who was I? And how had I let this happen? But it also gave me hope because it reminded me that becoming who you truly are isn't just a responsibility. It's a privilege. It's an opportunity to step into your own power, to live a life that's authentic and fulfilling. Psychologists talk about this in terms of self-actualization, which is the process of realizing your full potential. Maslow, another giant in psychology, described it as the pinnacle of his hierarchy of needs. But what Jung adds to this is the idea that self-actualization isn't just about achieving your goals or fulfilling your dreams. It's about integrating all the parts of yourself, even the ones you've been avoiding. So how do we do this? How do we become who we truly are? One of the most powerful tools I've found is reflection. Take a step back and ask yourself, what parts of myself have I been hiding? What dreams have I been ignoring because they don't fit into what other people expect of me? What values do I hold deep down, even if they don't align with what society says is important? For me, this process was both terrifying and liberating. I realized that I had been chasing goals that weren't really mine. I was trying to prove myself to people who didn't even matter. And the scariest part was letting go of those things because they had become a part of my identity. But once I did, I started to feel a sense of freedom that I had never felt before. I started to see glimpses of who I really was, and it was like coming home. This is the journey Jung is talking about. It's not easy. It requires courage, vulnerability, and a willingness to face the parts of yourself that you'd rather ignore. But the reward is worth it. The reward is a life that feels true to who you are, not who you think you're supposed to be. One practical exercise that can help is something called values clarification. Write down a list of your core values, the things that matter most to you. Then ask yourself, am I living in alignment with these values? If not, what needs to change? This exercise can be uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the ways you've been living out of alignment. But it's also incredibly empowering because it gives you a roadmap for becoming who you truly are. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. At first, this quote felt like a challenge. Like Jung was saying, you're not there yet, but now I see it as an invitation. It's an invitation to step into my own power, to embrace all the parts of myself, and to live a life that feels authentic and meaningful. These three quotes, from making the unconscious conscious, to facing our souls, to becoming who we truly are, have completely transformed the way I see myself and the world. They pissed me off because they forced me to confront truths that I didn't want to face. But they set me free because they showed me that transformation is possible. It's not easy. It's messy and uncomfortable, and sometimes downright painful. But it's also the most rewarding journey you'll ever take. When I look back on this journey, this messy, uncomfortable, transformative journey, I realized something important. These quotes didn't just piss me off because they were hard to understand or because they challenged me. They pissed me off because they were true. And the truth, especially when it's about yourself, is rarely easy to accept. But the more I leaned into these truths, the more I realized that Carl Jung wasn't trying to shame us or criticize us. He was trying to liberate us. He was handing us the keys to our own freedom, but those keys came with a price. We had to be willing to face ourselves. Let's go back to that first quote. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The more I sat with this, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by unconscious beliefs and patterns. And here's what blew my mind. It wasn't just the negative patterns, the ones that held me back, that were unconscious. It was also the positive ones. I had strengths, talents, and desires that I had buried just as deeply as my fears and insecurities. And because they were unconscious, I wasn't fully living them out. Let me give you an example. For years, I told myself that I wasn't a creative person. I believed I was analytical, logical, practical, but not creative. And that belief shaped the way I approached everything in my life. I avoided opportunities that required creativity. I dismissed my own ideas as unoriginal or unimportant. But when I started doing shadow work, when I started making the unconscious conscious, I realized that this belief wasn't true. It was something I had absorbed as a child when my creativity wasn't encouraged or valued. And the moment I brought that belief into the light, it lost its power over me. This is why making the unconscious conscious is so important. It's not just about breaking free from negative patterns, it's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that you've lost along the way. And the way to do that is through self-awareness. Start paying attention to your thoughts, your emotions, your behaviors. When you notice a pattern, whether it's a habit you can't break, an emotion you can't shake, or a thought that keeps coming up, ask yourself, where is this coming from? What's underneath this? The more you ask these questions, the more you'll start to uncover the unconscious beliefs that are driving your life. Now let's revisit that second quote. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. This one hit me in waves. At first it was about the obvious distractions, the scrolling, the binge watching, the constant busyness. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that avoidance goes much deeper than that. Sometimes we avoid ourselves in ways that look productive, even admirable. We throw ourselves into work, into helping others, into achieving our goals, not because we're genuinely passionate about those things, but because they keep us from having to sit with ourselves. I saw this in my own life. I used to pride myself on being a hard worker, on always striving for the next goal, the next achievement. But when I started digging deeper, I realized that a lot of that drive wasn't coming from a place of passion or purpose. It was coming from a place of fear. I was afraid of slowing down, of being still, of facing the parts of myself that I didn't want to acknowledge. And so I kept moving, kept achieving, kept distracting myself with productivity. This realization forced me to ask a hard question. What would happen if I stopped? What would happen if I let myself be still? The answer wasn't easy. When I finally slowed down, I had to face a lot of uncomfortable truths about myself, truths about my fears, my insecurities, my unmet needs. But I also discovered something beautiful. In the stillness, I found clarity. I found a connection. I found a sense of peace that I had been chasing in all the wrong places. And that brings me to the third quote. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This one was the hardest for me to accept because it forced me to confront the gap between who I was and who I wanted to be. It made me ask questions that I didn't want to ask. Who am I really? What do I value? What do I want out of life? And the scariest question of all, am I willing to let go of who I think I'm supposed to be in order to become who I truly am? This process is terrifying because it requires you to step into the unknown. It requires you to let go of the masks you've been wearing, the roles you've been playing, the expectations you've been trying to meet. But it's also exhilarating because it's the only way to live a life that feels real. And here's the thing, becoming who you truly are isn't about becoming someone new. It's about coming home to yourself. It's about peeling back the layers of conditioning and expectation to reveal the person you've always been. One of the most powerful exercises I've found for this is something called the ideal self-visualization. Close your eyes and imagine the person you want to be, not the person you think you should be, but the person who feels most authentic to you. What does that person look like? How do they act? What do they value? Spend some time with this image. Get to know this version of yourself. And then ask yourself, what's stopping me from being that person right now? When I did this exercise, I realized that the only thing standing in my way was fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of not being enough. But the more I worked through that fear, the more I started to embody my ideal self. I started making decisions that aligned with my values, not with other people's expectations. I started pursuing goals that felt meaningful to me, not just impressive to others. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living authentically. This is what Jung meant when he said that becoming who you truly are is the privilege of a lifetime. It's not an easy journey. It's messy and painful and full of uncertainty, but it's also the most rewarding thing you can do. Because when you become who you truly are, you're not just living, you're thriving. You're creating a life that feels meaningful, fulfilling, and deeply aligned with your soul. So what do these three quotes have in common? They all point to the same truth. The answers you're looking for aren't out there. They're here. They're in the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding, denying, or suppressing. And the only way to find them is to go inward, to face yourself, to do the hard, uncomfortable, transformative work of self-discovery. It's not easy. I won't pretend that it is, but it's worth it. Because when you make the unconscious conscious, when you stop avoiding your soul, when you become who you truly are, you set yourself free. And that freedom is the greatest gift you can give yourself. Now, here's my question for you. Are you ready to take that journey? Are you ready to face yourself, to do the work, to become who you truly are? Because if you are, everything can change. Not overnight, not without effort, but slowly, steadily, profoundly. And that's the privilege of a lifetime.